Jim Morgan, Aaron Tremblay here, coming to you from the Smyrna Church of Christ. Wanted to have an opportunity to spend some time together studying in God's Word, and wanted to encourage our Bible class teachers that study goes on, even if we're not here at the building.
Even though you're not teaching your class, you can still be studying and getting ready for your next one.
That's right. And
we've all got a lot more time for study now than we ever thought we were going to.
It'll add to our reputation now that it's just taken us that much longer to finish Daniel and Peter, respectively. But Jim and I were talking, and we wanted to be able to have some valuable study for you to consider. We encourage you as we're going through. If there's some things you want to study out a little bit more, feel free to pause the video. If it's a great discussion point that you want to take an opportunity and talk to your family about that point, or use a commentary or look at another Bible translation or any of those things, we encourage you, feel free to pause the video and engage in further study for yourself. Also wanted to mention, if you have any questions about this class, if you get them to us before next week, we'll be happy to answer and discuss them, and you could just send them to the Smyrna Church of Christ office email, and the office administrators will be happy to pass that along to us. So Jim, I'll let you go ahead and kind of introduce what we're talking about today.
Well, we were talking about all of the things that are coming about from the situation that we're going through now with the coronavirus. And an interesting headline caught my eye, and it said, "When the churches get back into business." And to me, that just gave an indication that if the buildings are closing down, then the church must be closed down. And I think that's such a prevalent attitude in America today, that might be worth some talking about.
Absolutely.
It's not something that we invented. It's something that goes back a long ways. And so maybe we can find a solution for it back there as well.
Sure. And, we spent some time right before all this happened looking at maybe some churches and situations where their priorities were a little bit out of control, and talking about, they had these videos come out of preachers chasing babies out of their worship, and other preachers saying we got to send all the old people out of our churches, and
strange things
happening, strange things, and
even before this time.
That's right. And so, but one of the things I think, when you look at all those situations and all the strange things that happen, people somehow lose their priority on what the church actually is. And it's not a church of just middle-aged people who either don't have little kids or the little kids are already grown up. It's not a church of middle-aged people who apparently, I have no idea what his problem was with the older generation, but the church is the people. The youngest people to the oldest people. That's the church. It doesn't matter. Jesus came and gave his life for all of us. We've all been added to the church through baptism, and so it's going to be comprised of a group of people.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the church is supposed to be. I saw a sign on a church building once that said, "This is where the church meets."
Yes.
And I think that's something that we don't need to lose sight of. But apparently it's been a problem all down through the ages. We were talking about Acts 17 is where we wanted to start. When Paul was in Athens and he goes through the city, and I've been to Athens, and you can look at the ruins, and if you look at the map that they give you, it's identified, okay, this is the ruins of this temple, and this is the ruins of this temple, and this is the ruins of this temple. There was an ancient Greek philosopher that said it's easier to find a god in Athens than it is to find a man. Because they just had temples everywhere.
Yeah.
And so in Acts 17, you want to go ahead and read what we got there?
So I'm going to start actually down at verse 22 if you're following along with us. I'm in Acts 17 verse 22, and I'm reading from the ESV. "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown. This I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in a temple made by man.'" You want me to pause there?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the cultural background. I know both of us have an interest in that, but in Athens, they every time that a ship would come in, they had a group that would go down to the harbor and meet them to find out if there's any religion that they've never heard of before. That's why they were interested in Paul, is because we've never heard of this before, so come talk to us about it. Because the Athenians' idea was that if you build a temple to a god, he is obligated to you. He has to protect your city because after all, we have a temple here for you, therefore you have to help us. And so they figured that the more temples they had, the more gods were going to be obligated to help them, and therefore they were going to be safer. So putting up a temple was a way of them saying, now we've got the god captured and he's going to have to work for us. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a real, what we would consider to be religious honoring the gods, so much as trying to make it to where the gods had to serve us.
Just trying to cover all their bases.
Every one of them. To
an extent, it reminds me a little bit of that coexist bumper sticker that tries to just cover all the religions. They were just trying to cover everything to say,
exactly.
We want to make sure we don't offend any gods.
Yeah.
And we want to almost, in a sense, have the gods serving us. Like you said, it's an obligatory thing to us.
Yeah.
And I know the Areopagus, the men who met there, were kind of considered the morality police a little bit to make sure their task was, you make sure we're on good terms with all the gods, because when we go off to war, we don't want to be losing these battles, or if war comes to us, we don't want to lose our city.
Yeah, that's what it says back in verse 21. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like what we're doing right now, because we're
sort of
stuck
like
at
this.
home.
Everybody is doing that
yes,
now.
Yes. And he makes this point about the unknown God. Now, this is Paul speaking. He makes this point about this altar that he finds with this inscription. And what do we know about this altar of the unknown God?
Well, we found it. It's mentioned several times. We found an altar that says to the unknown. Mm-hmm. And so, this is archaeologically, this is on about as firm a ground as you can, because you can point to it and say, that's what he's talking about right there.
Yeah.
But it does give you an idea of how strange the church sounded to people when at the end of the story, instead of putting up a temple to God, they walk away and say, well, we'll get back to you, I'll have my girl get in touch with your girl, and we'll do lunch. Is the way we put it.
And I like that Paul mentions how religious they are. Mm-hmm. They're religious. They're desiring to be pleasing to the gods or whatever, to the point that they even want to make sure if there's one we don't know about, we want to even honor him.
Yeah. And
I love that Paul locks in on that and says, well, let me tell you about that unknown God. Let me tell you who that God is.
Yeah, he begins where they are.
Exactly. And so I think that's a powerful thing. And as he begins to expound on who God really is in verse 24, he starts by making a declaration of what God's territory is, right?
Yeah.
Because all these other gods had territories too, as you mentioned, might be from this country or that country, or might protect this part of Greece, or they're over the crops, or they're over the rain, or they're over the god of war.
Which is why they wanted a little bit of territory for every god, because outside of that territory, he's not much use.
That's right. And so he starts right there with God and says, God, this unknown God I'm going to introduce you to, the God, made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth. So let me tell you about this God. He made all of it, and he's Lord of all of it. Mm-hmm. So if you're on earth, you're under his lordship. You're under, this God is over wherever you are.
Yeah. And then he starts losing his audience in the very next passage, and does not live in temples built by hands.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. That's what Athens is all about.
Right, and almost in a sense, you guys have been wasting your time building all these temples.
Basically. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Mm-hmm. So he's beginning to lose his audience already, because this is the whole idea that they built it on.
Exactly. And I like in 25, not as he's served by human hands, as though he needed anything. Mm-hmm. Right? Since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath, and he doesn't just say and crops, or and victory in battle, or and the rain, or wisdom. He says he gives him life and breath and everything. Mm-hmm. So this is the God who made everything. His sovereignty is over the heavens and the earth, everything that's in them, and he gives mankind everything.
Yeah. And the really sad part of this, moving on, but the really sad part of this is Paul was very well qualified to talk about God being confined to a building because of his Jewish background. Mm-hmm. Because when you go back into the Old Testament and you look at the people of God, it's fairly obvious that very early they started thinking that as long as they had the tabernacle, or as long as they had the temple, they had God right where they wanted him.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And to kind of just close out this section because I want to focus really in on does not live in temples made by man.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to kind of finish out this section. It makes several more good points. Verse 26, from one man made every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. So this God you're telling me about, is he a Roman God? Is he a Greek God? What is he a God of? Well, he's the God of every nation, of all mankind, and everybody who lives on the face of the earth. That's pretty all-inclusive, right?
Yeah.
Having determined a lot of periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. And here's what I like. Yet he's not actually far from each of us.
Yeah.
So he doesn't dwell in a temple made with human hands, and he's not the God of even the United States or Canada or whatever the case may be. I mean, he has no territories and boundaries, right? And even though, you and I could be, we are from completely different parts of the country, it makes no difference. In the South, it's not that, God's closer to you because you're in the South, or you're from the North, so God's closer to you in the North. It's, no, God is the God of everything, and the truth is, no matter where we are, he's not far from us.
He's just as close to us when we're in Nashville, Tennessee, or Smyrna, Tennessee, as he is when I was in Bucharest, Romania,
Absolutely.
or when you were in Boston, Massachusetts, another foreign country.
Exactly.
But because he is everywhere, he is the same distance from all of us.
And I think that's a reassuring thing for us, even in the midst of this time that we're in, that God is not limited to this building that we're recording from, that God is not limited to Smyrna, that God is not limited to Tennessee, United States, etc., that God is not far from all of us. And in fact, as Christians, we're told that he dwells in us. Yeah. And so wherever we are, God is with us.
And I've heard people talk and actually use the phrase, if the United States is destroyed, God's in trouble. No, he's not.
He was here, I think, before the United States was.
Yeah, he'll be here a long time after we're gone if Jesus doesn't come back before that.
Yeah. So this phrase, I want to go back to about the temples being built by man in verse 24. It's not the only time that this phrase enters into the picture under the reign of Christ, right? I'm thinking in terms of Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, when he's relaying basically the gospel message to them. They're not really that willing to hear it, but part of what he includes is this quotation that goes all the way back to, of all places, not quite Genesis, but the Old Testament. It's still important. And so as Stephen is giving his defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he tells them about this quote that comes, as the great prophet said, is kind of the way he phrases it, going back to, let me turn back there, Acts chapter 7, dropping down to verse 47. He says, but it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, as the prophet says. So now he's going to move from, actually, if you go back and look at the context, almost the entire speech, but specifically here, starting at 44, he's in the Old Testament the whole time.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Talking about the people in the wilderness, Moses
his
follows
Bible.
the pattern. Exactly. Joshua, he brings up all those things. And ultimately, verse 46, where he says, who found favor in the sight of God and asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. So here in 47, it was Solomon who builds it, yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands. According to the prophet Isaiah, I'm adding that in there, but going back to Isaiah 66, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all things? And there I think it's kind of going back to Acts 17 again, right? Where did everything come from? What? God created everything in the heavens and on the earth. So if I build God a house of gold, that came from God. So it's not really a suitable house for God. I mean, I'm using his stuff to build him a house. He doesn't,
And
so
again, it's not even an exclusively pagan problem, because they killed Stephen for saying this.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So they take umbrage at
To say the
his
least.
statement, right?
And then they take stones.
That's right. And in fact, in Isaiah 66, I'm just going to jump there and come right back. But in verse 2 of that chapter, it says, all these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to be, declares the Lord. But this is the one to whom I will look, the one who is humble, is contrite in spirit, and trembles at my word. So what God's saying is, I'm looking for a dwelling place, but you can't build me a dwelling place. I mean, what could you possibly build me? But he says, here's where I'm looking to dwell. Here's the person I'm looking for. Someone who's humble, contrite in spirit, and trembles at my word. And the fulfillment of that comes with Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Because God now dwells in us if we choose to be a people who are humble, contrite in spirit, and tremble at his word. So I think there's a great tie-in that even goes beyond, where Stephen gets to, although it doesn't, because in verse 51 he says, you stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit.
Yeah,
so
someone said he really needs to work on his invitation.
Yeah. And so, again, going back to Isaiah 66 and verse 2, you're supposed to be humble, contrite in spirit, and tremble at God's word. And he says, you're stiff-necked, not humble, not circumcised in heart or your ears, and you always resist the Spirit. Sounds like the opposite of what Isaiah was saying. This is who God looks to dwell in, and these people, they're not them. So their hope was in, I hope he lives in the temple built with our hands, because he was certainly not going to live as a stiff-necked people. He wasn't going to dwell in them.
And that's why, my favorite part as we were talking about this, Jeremiah 7.
Yeah.
That just is an incredible passage about that. Where it starts in verse 4. Says, do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your forefathers forever and ever. But look, you're trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. So instead of the right kind of people to be the house, they think that living in the house, they can do whatever they want to.
That's right.
It says, will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods that you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we're safe. Safe to do all these detestable things.
And I love that he mentions, stand before me in this house. This is supposed to be my house.
Yeah.
And you're coming in my house and doing these things.
And
right?
and we're safe.
Yeah, we're safe. No
we're
problem.
Here. It's okay.
We got the temple. We're good.
No problem. And then the verse that Jesus is going to quote, has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. And then he talks about Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. And he says, go down there and find out what happened to the first house. Well, it was destroyed. And so he says, and he says, what I did to Shiloh, I will do to this place. But their confidence was in the building. Yeah. They thought that was what their religion was. It was the building. And God says, you can't just stand there and say, hey, it's the temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord.
And it's really interesting, when you go back through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you watch the idolatry. It starts on the borders of both the southern and the northern kingdom, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of starts sneaking in a little bit at a time, but by the time you get to where the temple's going to be destroyed, it's in the temple. It's gone from the outskirts of town to in everybody's house, closer. Now all of a sudden it's in Jerusalem, and then ultimately in the temple. I mean, so you can watch the snowball effect.
Yeah. The passage we were talking about before we started filming in Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Where he says, look in that hole and see what you see. And there's all of the elders of Israel, and they're worshiping idols.
And each one has his own room with all the idols painted on the wall. And it's interesting there in Ezekiel chapter 8 that it's like they think that nobody sees what, and they have their sensors and they're filling the room with smoke. It's like, it's a dark room, it's hidden, it's filled with smoke. Nobody knows what I'm doing. And God's like, he doesn't need the people, but he tells Ezekiel, just go take a look at there and see what they're doing.
Put that hole in the wall.
Yeah.
They didn't even know there was a hole in the wall. But, it goes back further. He mentions Shiloh, with the tabernacle. And if you remember the story early in David's career, where the people are defeated in battle by the Philistines, so the next time out, they take the tabernacle with them because they say, God, we couldn't possibly be defeated if we take the tabernacle with us.
He's got no power in Philistine.
Yeah, it reminds me of Indiana Jones, where it says, any army that has the tabernacle cannot be defeated, or the Ark of the Covenant cannot be defeated. Well, they need to go back and check their Bible real closely because they lose. The Philistines end up with the tabernacle.
Yeah.
The Philistines figure, we've captured the God of Israel, and it turns out it's the exact opposite. The God of Israel has now captured them, and they end up sending it back with a payment to Israel. Here, take this thing back.
Please take it back.
So, it started with very early. The idea that as long as we have these things with us, as long as we've got this building or a tent, God's got to protect us.
That's right.
And then there's 3 temples,
Mm-hmm.
and every one of them was destroyed, and they still missed the point.
Yeah, and it still doesn't seem to click with them. And, you know, it's a great point because the north is taken first. The northern kingdom falls. Israel falls first. And it's kind of like, if you're in the southern kingdom, there was 10 tribes up there, and they fell first. And they don't just fall. They don't get what Judah gets, which is, or the southern kingdom, you get to go to exile, but you're going to come back. No, Israel gets, you're just wiped off the map. I mean, that's the end of it, right? They don't get to come back in the same fashion that the southern kingdom does. And in fact, you know, are kind of spread by Assyria, you know, hither and yon, or however you want to say it.
Hither, thither, yon, and
yeah, exactly. But that should have been a huge warning to them that, hey, we can fall too. And as the armies are coming, I mean, they take all the fortified cities are listed, Lachish and all these others are taken, and they're at the door of Jerusalem. And I mean, it's a way bigger army than they could possibly hope to defeat on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they still don't seem to get the fact that Jerusalem can fall, even with the temple there, you know.
Well, and that's where Jeremiah comes in, because that's when he's going to be preaching.
Exactly.
And he says, you stand here and you think you're safe.
And you're yelling, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, you know. And they're robbing the temple of the Lord to pay off people, meantime, right?
Yeah, in all 3, teaching Daniel, in all 3 of the exiles, where, you know, Nebuchadnezzar takes people, it says, and he takes part of the stuff from the temple.
That's right.
Well, they should have figured out
should
something.
have been a big
there.
indication.
Yeah.
And then the kicker is in Ezekiel 10, when God gives Ezekiel this vision of him, first the 4 cherubim come, and it's kind of this crazy image of a chariot with these wheels, and they're
Ezekiel saw the wheels.
Yeah, at first it goes to the threshold of the temple, and you're kind of like, ooh, God's moving. I mean, he hasn't left the temple, but he's moving. But then all of a sudden it goes from the threshold to the gate to,
I'm out of here.
I'm out of here. Elvis has left the building. And I mean, the people's faith was in the temple, but I think what God's trying to show Ezekiel and the people is, I am not limited to the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And these abominations that apparently they're starting to get pretty bolder about because the temple's there, it's like God says, that's enough, and I'm leaving. And once God's presence is gone from among his people, it's not about the temple. It's about God's presence being with his people.
Yeah.
Once that leaves, I don't care if you attack that city with 3 people or, you know, I mean, all of a sudden it's not going to help them. The thickness of your walls and your siege preparations, all that's not going to mean anything.
And then he gives them 70 years to think about it.
Yeah.
And when they come back, they do the foundations of the temple.
Yeah.
And then they quit and go work on their own houses.
Yeah.
You know, it says you got paneled houses. Well, they didn't go down to Home Depot in Jerusalem and buy it. They had to make it. It was very labor intensive and expensive, but they could do their houses. But the thing that gets me is when they finish the foundation and they have this celebration, the older people who remembered the first temple are crying because this isn't as good, as if somehow that makes a difference to God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've got to have it fancy here. We got to have all of the stuff that we had before. The young people are happy. We got a temple, and the older people are just really squashing that.
Sure.
Because it's not anything. It's nothing compared to what it used to be.
Yeah. It ain't as good as it once was.
Yeah.
In good
And so, you know, it just, after 70 years of thinking about it, they still. Then, the fanciest temple ever built was built by Herod, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, exactly.
That ought to tell them something right there.
Right. And that temple, I think, has the shortest actual lifespan of all the temples that they built. I mean,
it does.
And it was built with their government's approval, with Rome's approval, with Herod's own builders, as you're saying. I mean, he was the architect kind of behind it. But it lasted
people
the
from
shortest time.
Jews from all over the world every year would send an offering to the temple.
Yeah.
And it said that it got to the point where they didn't have anything else to do. And so I think it's Josephus talks about a golden vine they wrapped around the walls of the temple with leaves because they didn't have anything else to do with it.
Yeah.
And so they would put up this golden vine because, you know, we got to make the temple look great.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's all smashed by the Romans.
And it's all for naught, right? Like, you can dress it up any way you want and cover it in
Mm-hmm.
gold, but if you're not living for and obeying the God that the temple's meant to be representative of, what good is it going to?
You can say it's the temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple
That's
of the
right,
Lord.
and that's God's point all along. You're making a declaration. You recognize something significant about the temple, which is what God wanted from them all along. Back when Solomon builds it, He wants them to recognize a significance in the temple, but only to the point that it points to God, right? And says God is the one that we worship, and that's the significant thing. And obviously, according to Jeremiah, you go to Isaiah, the first 5 chapters of Isaiah, and Isaiah does the same thing. God says, your singing makes me crazy, your offerings make me sick. Like, I don't want any of this from you, because with one hand you offer an offering, and with the other hand you got blood all over your hands from taking advantage of the sojourners and the fatherless and the widows. Right?
Well, that passage that you pointed out in 2 Chronicles, that tells what it is. Have you got that?
Yeah. So, well, there's a couple. So 2 Chronicles 6:18 and 1 Kings 8:27 both have Solomon's prayer of dedication. And it says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven is the highest heaven, which can't contain you, how much less this house that I've built. And listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray towards this place, and listen in heaven, your dwelling place, and hear when you hear and forgive." So this isn't your dwelling place, this building, but heaven is your dwelling place.
It gets off to a great start.
Yeah.
And then the second Chronicles passage.
Let me jump to 2 Chronicles, for those of you who are trying to follow along. This is 2 Chronicles 2, and I'm going to go ahead and jump to verse 6. There's some good meat and bones in the first 5 verses too, but let me just jump to verse 6 and show you this key piece. It says, "But he who is able to build him a house, since heaven..." I'm sorry, let me read that again. "But who is able to build him a house, since heaven, even the highest heaven, can't contain him? Who am I to build a house for him?" Now here's the key part I want you to focus on. "Except as a place to make offerings before him."
Yeah.
So that there's a purpose of the house. There's a purpose of the temple. And
they knew it.
And they knew it. And they knew what
it
the
was
purpose was.
proclaimed to them.
Right.
But they went and changed it to something else.
And the phrase that you use, that the house, the temple, is in service to God. That's the function of it. We have no purpose of this place except to make an offering to God, to serve God with this place as its function, not for God to serve that place or be confined to that place.
Not like Athens.
Correct, exactly.
Where everything is done for our benefit.
It's the opposite principle that's employed there, and that seems to be where they lost it. So the transition becomes for us now we're learning, whether we want to be learning this lesson or not, we're learning the lesson right now of the church is not the building.
Yeah.
Because if the church was the building, then the church would be closed.
Yeah, like that headline that we started with.
Exactly.
When the churches get back in business.
Correct. And so we're carrying on being the church, even if we can't come to this building. It doesn't matter. We're going to continue being the church, whether we're here or in our homes or wherever you put us. We're going to keep doing the things that God wants us to do.
Which is probably one good thing that could come out of this, is a reminder of that the church is not the building. Because let's face it, we identify the church with the building. When we talk about we're going to the church, it means we're going down to the building. Everybody knows that with vampires, they can't follow you into church, a building, because that's consecrated territory. And that's just crazy. I've even heard people argue, even among us in churches of Christ, that if you weren't baptized in a building that has Church of Christ on the front, then it's no good.
That's right. It has to be in the building.
Yeah, it has to be in the building, and the building becomes the church. When you go on vacation, and someone says, "Yeah, we saw a lot of churches." Well, it doesn't mean they saw a whole bunch of people standing around outside. It means we saw a bunch of buildings.
Yeah.
And so even in our day, and some of it's just sloppy language, but I think others we've identified the same way that the pagans, the same way that the Jews did. The church is the building.
Yeah, we got to get away from let's have church or let's go to church. We have to get away from that stuff and get to let's be the church.
Yeah. Or if you use church as a verb, we go to church. I mean, it's something we do. So, yeah. But, that, like I said, I think that's one thing that could come out of this is a reminder the church is still functioning. You look at all the stuff that the church is supposed to do. Worship. Well, we're not here at the building, but at 9 o'clock in spirit, we're all gathered together because we've got, our leaders put together, and you doing a great job, have put together a worship service that we can all sit at our computers, the internet that we're blessed with, where it's a reminder that it can be a blessing, not just a place for pornography.
Sure.
But it's a place where in a time like this we can all get together and we can all be in spirit, and at the same time, that's still going on.
Mm-hmm.
Evangelism is still going on because we've got our work in Honduras that's still going on. Work's still going on in other places. Matter of fact, this might be a time when people start thinking about their relationship with God. And then, of course, benevolence.
Yeah,
Our pantries are still open. We're
Mm-hmm.
still, helping people with bills. We're still doing a lot of things.
And we're praying.
And we're praying.
More than we ever have,
Yeah. And I think, from watching the news network a lot more than I ever have before. But I think that Channel 5 has one good slogan that says, "Kindness is not canceled." And I think if the church can't engage in kindness, then somewhere along the line, we've lost everything that's important.
If we can't find a way to shine in this time, then we've lost it.
Yeah.
Because the light shines brightest at the dawn, right? In the midst of darkness is the greatest opportunity for light to reveal itself.
Well, it's a little bit out of context, but Jesus said, "I didn't come to the healthy, I came to the sick."
Yeah.
We got a lot of sick people right
Came
now.
to seek and save the lost.
Physically and spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take care of one, maybe they'll want to take care of the other one as well.
Yeah. And I think
And we can do it without a building.
That's right. We don't have to have the building.
I mean, you and I could be sitting out in the parking lot, but it'd be cold.
That's right. That's right. And so, I think that's where God's people lost it. And here's where I think it translates to us. The center of their spirituality was the temple. Mm-hmm. They didn't want any unclean people in the temple. They didn't want the Gentiles past a certain point in the temple. They didn't want the women past a certain point in the temple. Their spirituality was connected to that. You need to be godly at the temple.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you need to be God. You better have your act together when you're at the temple, and you better bring the right sacrifice, and so at the temple is where I have to be godly. Now, once they left the courts of the temple, it was like a free-for-all. That wasn't God's intention, and when they were doing right by God, that's not what was going on. But they get to this place where it's like God's, spirituality, holiness is kind of contained to this building. And so when I'm there, I need to bring my Bible, or I need to pray, or I need to do these things. But once I leave, once I've done my part of that at this place, now I can go do what I really want to do. And we know that's what's happening because God says, as soon as you leave, you're taking advantage of the fatherless and the widow. You're murdering, you're being deceptive, you're offering stuff to Baal. Inside the temple, you're acting like a godly person, but once you leave, everything changes.
I've already brought up vampires, so anything past that is stranger. But there's a group called Counting Crows. I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, but they had a really interesting double album that I thought the title was very provocative. It says Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. About the difference, how people think they can behave on Saturday night, but as long as they go to the building, as long as they go to church on Sunday morning, everything's going to be okay. And I think that's a pretty common attitude. It's easier to seek forgiveness than permission.
Sure.
And we apply that to church as well.
It can be so easy as people to get ourselves in that mindset. But what Stephen says, what Paul says, and actually that phrase, Lord of heaven and earth, it's in the Old Testament, New Testament. And the whole point of that, though, right, is since the beginning, God has never been a territorial God. He's always been the God of everything. He's always been the God of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, so on and so. Every day of the week, he's beyond the realm of time. He's beyond the realm of space. He's not just the God of Israel. He's the God of the world, right? And so I don't know what it is that draws us into this mentality of thinking, I have to be this way when I'm within these physical parameters, but once I leave, it's okay. It's like the elders in Ezekiel 8, right? Like as long as I go under the temple in this dark room,
nobody sees,
nobody's looking,
me and my buddies,
then I can do what I want. But then when I have to do my temple duties, I'll come back out from here and put on the show, right? But then I'll go back to worshiping the gods I really want to worship.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, the God of heavens and earth, at the end in Revelation, when everything's back the way that God intended it to be in the first place, he says it's a new creation, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, because God's in control again.
Yeah.
He's created, now he is purified. but it all goes back to He's the God of heaven and earth, and even when there's a new heaven and a new earth, it's because God is there.
Mm.
So it all goes back to Genesis.
It does. It does. And I mean, the reason that can be is because of what Hebrews says. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Yeah.
Right? So if I go to Genesis to look at God, I'll find God.
Mm-hmm.
If I go to New Testament to find God, I'll find God. If I look at today, I'll find it's the same God. And so I think that's powerful, and I think that's the key. What can we learn? We look at Jeremiah, we look at places like the first 5 chapters of Isaiah. I mean, just throughout the prophets of God's people putting on a facade. And then we see it in the New Testament. It doesn't change between the Old and the New Testament because the Pharisees are playing the same game, right?
Yeah.
And so...
Well, and the oldest book that we have of the New Testament is Revelation. In chapters 2 and 3, he talks about they say they are this and they say they are this, but they're not.
So how do we avoid that same trust? So here we are, and we've kind of been forced out of our comfort zone. We're forced out of the building. We're not here gathering anymore. So that helps a little bit, I think. But what do we?
Hopefully for not too long.
Yeah, exactly. How do we help? How do we use this time to help shape our perspective in a better way, and understanding the consistency, the fact that God doesn't want to be Lord of our Sundays, but God wants to be Lord of our life every day. We're in the faith at home room. It's not the faith at church room, right? Faith at the building room, because we don't want people to be Christians here. We don't want one day a week to be, this is when I sow the seeds of growing my faith. We want that to happen every single day. And we want God to be the Lord of your home and not just the Lord of your family when you're in church.
And at a time like this, you can do that because every day brings a new opportunity to be the church. It has nothing to do with the building whatsoever. And
it should help us to have a clearer vision of our relationship with God as individuals and as families. There's so many less distractions, so many less ways for us to say, why isn't the church, have this program for me or do this for me? There's a sense.
I'm not taking my kids on trips anymore.
Yeah, there's a lot more responsibility, right? And in the same sense that parents have a lot more responsibility now for teaching their kids, where before they could pass on some of that responsibility to the teachers. Well,
no more free babysitting.
Right now, so much more of it is on the parents, and so. How do we avoid falling into these same pitfalls? I mean, the Israelites weren't inherently some kind of more evil people than we are. I mean, they were well intentioned, but over time they allow their lives to be turned away from God. Yeah,
they became comfortable. So, and that's in every. Well, it's like the old Chinese. The saying about, the Chinese symbol for opportunity and disaster is the same. We've got a disaster going here, but there's opportunities if we decide we want to be the church. Remembering that, in the New Testament, we talk about the New Testament church. In the New Testament, there were no church buildings that we would recognize. But they were the church. And that's when the church was doing its best work.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get back to that.
And the verses from John 4 come to mind where Jesus talks about dealing with the proper place for worship, right? And he talks about the idea of the woman asks him, where is the right place for worship? On this mountain or Jerusalem? And Jesus says, look, a time's coming where the mountain that you worship on is going to be completely irrelevant. Location isn't going to matter anymore.
It's interesting that she's a Samaritan. It's the northern tribes.
Right.
They never got it right in the first place.
Right.
And Jesus says, it's okay, you're going to get another shot.
That's right. And everybody will. Because at that point, it's worshiping in spirit and truth. But truly, all along, God was never just a God of Jerusalem or the God of the Samaritans. I mean, he had been a God who could be worshipped anywhere all along.
Absolutely. So, well, I think we've gone about as far time-wise as we had planned to. Certainly, if you want to take this, start your own thoughts, think through it, look at other verses. That's what this class is supposed to be all about. If there's anything you want us to talk about, just send it to the SmyrnaChurchOfChrist.org, and Nancy or Amy will see to it that we get it, and we'll be more than happy to do what we can with it. But I would like to leave with a slogan that we sort of came up with that Aaron's already referred to, and that is that in everything, God is not in service to the building is in service to God. Amen. And we are God's building.
That's right. His dwelling place.
Stay safe. stay socially distant, do what's smart, and hopefully soon we'll get back together again.
Amen.
So, we thank you. Okay, and we'll see you next week.